We're very fortunate to welcome back to the Ontario Assembly of Workplace Democracy four of our guests that we've already heard from earlier. Sarah Slynn, of course, Associate Professor of Labor and Employment Law at Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto, an expert on broader-based bargaining, among other things. And you may recall, of course, her presentation that laid out some of the finer points on that, sectoral versus multi-workplace, et cetera. Meredith Woodwork, Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior and Human Resource Management at Wilfrid Laurier University, who spoke to us earlier in our session about job satisfaction and corporate performance, voice and loyalty in the workplace environment. Cynthia Estlin, the Catherine A. Rain Professor of Law at New York University School of Law, who spoke to us about democratic entitlement in the workplace and employer responsibilities. I think we all recall responding well to her presentation that asked whether authoritarian rule by employers is even a problem. And of course, Rafael Gomez, Chair of the Ontario Assembly, Director of the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at U of T, and an expert on various aspects around worker voice, including civic participation. So let me welcome our four guests. Our members have been working in their last small group discussion around coming up with some questions for you. There are many questions and ideas that remain lingering. The next step, just to give you all a perspective, this afternoon we'll be forming ourselves into small working groups to start to craft recommendations from our policy options. And so this stage where we've invited you back to interact with the Assembly is a kind of a very pivotal one in this Assembly. So we're really fortunate to have you back, and I'm looking forward to the interaction. Here's how this will work. I'm going to call on a representative from each of our six working small groups from this morning, invite you to ask your top question that you've identified in your group. After that, I'll invite anyone to raise their Zoom hand or put a question or comment in the chat to continue the Q&A for the rest of the time available to us, and we'll finish up around the top of the hour for one more thing before we get to lunch. I'm going to unshare my screen so that we can see the faces of our members and our guests as they speak. However, if anyone needs me to put up anything on screen for your reference, previous slide, for example, please let me know as you ask and answer your questions. I'm going to get started with Mark. Sorry to put you on the spot, but you were the first one to come to my list. So from the breakout group facilitated by Anna, Mark, can I invite you to go first, and then we'll take it from there to the rest of our groups.
Yeah, so one of the first questions we had, we think it would be good for Meredith. It may be broad, but how do we modify existing policies to better accommodate diverse workplaces, such as one example was brought up, religious holidays and such not, seeing that Canada is more of a Christian or based around a Christian belief system. Other religions aren't as, our other religious holidays aren't really mandated by the government.
Oh, I can't unmute myself. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I could. Thank you, Mark. That's a really interesting question. I was thinking about that the other day because there was a discussion around, now I've got to remember which election it was, but I think it was the Ontario municipal elections conflict with a religious holiday in, I'm not sure, I can't remember. I think it was a Muslim community, but I'm not positive about that. Anyways, so I was thinking about this. How are we going to handle this going forward as a society? Because if you recognize all religious holidays around the calendar, we'd never be without holidays, right? So I think that the general, I think what employers and organizations are going to have to start thinking about is, how do we set general principles around this issue? Like, how do we decide what are fair and equitable ways of handling the fact that we don't all share the same holidays? You know, historically we have had sort of Christian Judeo holidays in this country, but it's less and less a reflection of who we are now. So how do we reflect that in the organizations? And to be honest, I don't know of a lot of research into how organizations are doing that right now. But from a practical standpoint, I think that organizations are going to have to develop policies that say, you know, we recognize that not everyone's religious holidays fall into our traditional set of governmental holidays in Ontario or Canada, wherever you're looking. And we want to be flexible about that. I think that personally, I think that the approach to take is to allow people some flexibility about which holidays they want to recognize and which holidays they don't want to recognize. So instead of having organizations completely closed on certain days for everyone, you could have organizations open for some people for whom it's not a holiday, and have those people come to work those days if they choose, and then other people not, and then vice versa, right? So people who want to take off particular religious holidays, there's a process by which you can say, you know, this is a holiday that matters to me, I'm willing to trade it off for other holidays. I don't know what's going to happen in that space, but I think it's a really important discussion that a lot of organizations are going to have to wrestle with. You know, there's a lot of benefits for organizations that way too. You could have the ability to serve more diverse populations if you're not only recognizing certain holidays and people are willing to trade off these sorts of things. But from an empirical study perspective, I can tell you that I'm not aware of anyone researching who is doing that kind of work right now. Like what organizations are actually tackling those policies and trying to make those changes. I think it's a great space for future research, but I am not aware of anybody who's doing it. I will, because I'm curious about this, I'm going to do some looking around afterwards just to see if I can find anybody that I've missed, and I'll let you know if I know of any research around that. But that's my sense. I think it's an opportunity, and that's one of the things that organizations hopefully will recognize, is that if you start to manage holidays, diverse holidays differently, there are benefits, there are potential benefits for organizations. I think organizations tend to think, oh, that's going to be crazy, it's going to be complicated, how are we going to manage this? But I think it's doable, and I think there's a lot of potential benefits that I hope organizations can see.
Thanks.
Okay.
I think, yeah. Should I go with my next question?
Thank you for that. No, I'm going to go around the room and then we'll come back around again. But
okay.
Thank you for that. You've given us some sort of food for thought around how we can resolve that particular issue that's come up. And we would certainly appreciate if you find any research that points us towards ideal policy options on that issue. Meredith, we'd love to hear from you before we meet again as an assembly. I mean, even if you have an email to Andrew or someone, we can share that with the members before we meet again next Saturday. I'm going to move on to Fatima next, and then Matt will be after that. Fatima, please go ahead.
Hi, good evening. So the major question I would like to ask on behalf of my group is directed towards Professor Slynn as it relates to sectoral bargaining. Professor Slynn, we were wondering, in our discussion, we touched on the difference between majority and minority unions, and how in majority unions, they can take part in collective bargaining by negotiating salaries and wages and whatnot for workers, but it doesn't look like that same power is extended to minority unions because they're a minority. So with hopes of diversifying worker voice and whatnot, we were wondering, in what ways do you envision sectoral bargaining or collective bargaining being implemented, and how it can work together with minority unionism in a way that can hopefully, leave the workers appeased at the end of the day.
There are two, well, as we talked about the other day, there's actually a whole spectrum, an array of broader-based and sectoral bargaining models. So there are some sectoral bargaining models, and a true sectoral model that is in fact collective bargaining rather than, you know, an advisory type of negotiation that exists, that is actually a form of minority unionism. So minority unionism in the sense that not a majority needs to be demonstrated for that particular representative to gain formal representative and formal bargaining powers. So sectoral bargaining can certainly be structured in a way that doesn't require demonstration of majority support. And in fact, that's reasonably common. When you're talking about minority unionism, I think you're talking about having the potential for multiple representative agents in any given workplace or bargaining unit. Is that how you're using the term minority unionism? So let me give two options here. Minority unionism can refer to a bargaining agent getting representative powers without having to show it has majority support. It can also involve a situation where there's the potential for multiple bargaining agents in for a particular group of workers having representative powers. So the other way that a sectoral or broader-based bargaining regime could reflect or incorporate minority unionism in that second sense, where there's the potential for multiple bargaining agents or representative agents to simultaneously be involved, is where the bargaining or negotiation is being done by a council or a subset with representatives, a number of representatives from the workers. So it's, you know, it's very flexible. There's broader-based or sectoral bargaining can be constructed as kind of like Build-A-Bear in some ways, with a number of elements that you want to include.
Okay, thank you.
So
Tina, did you want to
basically,
follow up?
yeah, I just wanted to say, so what I'm getting from you is that there is a way to structure, you know, a minority union that can include sectoral bargaining without majority support. That's what you said?
Yeah, there are fundamentally two ways of doing that. Either having sectoral bargaining where there's one representative, so one, we'll call it a union, it doesn't have to be a union, where that union gets formal government sanctioned authority to negotiate on behalf of a sector, but does not have to demonstrate majority support. And for example, in Canada right now, in the federal jurisdiction and in Quebec, we have the status of the Artist Act. And an association that wants to represent workers there, all they have to demonstrate is that they have basically significant membership, significant representation among workers there. It doesn't have to be majority. The other way it can work is that the worker representatives in the bargaining, it is not one single organization, but it's basically a council. So the representatives on that council can be drawn from a variety of different organizations, including ones that do not have haven't demonstrated majority support among workers in that sector.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Slan.
And thank you very much, Fatima. I'm going to move next to Matt, and then we'll go with Abel after that. So Matt, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Hi, I think this question, we decided that it would go to Professor Gomez, and it's about immigration rights and how can we legislate immigration rights or immigrant rights, and make them enforceable and give them more voice and equity with their employers.
I'm going to turn my video on in a semi-quiet spot. It's a good question. It's funny, I was doing an interview with the Globe about this assembly. They might write a piece about what you are all doing. And this question came up actually. And forgive me if I don't answer it precisely enough for you, you can do a follow-up. I think given the numbers of workers in Canada who currently are under, like Dina Ladd described last, I think it was last session, under these stringent work-related relationships where, because of their particular status, either as students from abroad studying here or as temporary foreign workers or as part of the agricultural worker program, they're essentially tied to one employer. And if they do anything to weaken that particular relationship, they can then be sent back to their homes. So there's no real true labor mobility in that sense. And those workers, therefore, have, and there are a large number of them, have this effect that make democratic ideas in the workplace kind of moot. You can have the best voice mechanisms on paper, but if people are even afraid to use them because of this precarious status with their immigration status here in the country, those mechanisms actually won't work very well, even for workers who don't have that precarity, because they're a part of the same workforce often, working side by side. There's some workers who have this precariousness attached to their immigration status and others that aren't, and to mobilize a group of workers inside to raise concerns or questions to management, even ones that would be of use to management, like a problem at work, will just not be raised. So one of the proposals that could come out of this is to strengthen voice. You have to give people access to permanent residency much more easily, especially if people are otherwise hardworking. There's no criminal record. There's no real issue why they shouldn't be considered citizens of the country. They're working here. They're producing here. That, I think, is something that needs to be looked at as a kind of holistic view of what makes voice and having a say at work work. I'm not sure if this is a good answer to your question or your issue.
What do you think?
I would
Matt?
just, yeah.
I like the idea of giving people permanent residency status easier. I guess the follow-up question to it would be, obviously the permanent residency status can't come right away for the person, so they can't have the level of rights that any other Canadian would have for at least some period of time. What could we do for the people who are in that that kind of gray area where they're living in Canada but don't have their permanent residency status for at least some period of time? Like, let's say it's like the time limit is like 3 months and then they get their permanent residency status. Like, still be a really shitty 3 months for those people.
I agree. So in that case, you know, we could give those workers the same rights those workers have in a free, liberal market system, right? The right to quit and find better employment. So long as you have, the fear is, of course, is you bring people from abroad who have very few attachments here, and if they lose their job, they're going to be destitute or have no access to the system of taking care of themselves materially. But if they can prove that they have a better offer, tangible one, on the table, they should be allowed to move from an employer that's not fulfilling its end of the bargain, or for whatever reason. Why do we put even any limits? If I want to change my job, I change my job. There's not compelling evidence I have to put in front of a judge to sort of say why I have to move my job. But if you can show that that you have credible employment offers somewhere else that's better for you, why not? And that would be a good mechanism in those intervening months, if you will, that workers could use. Because without this pressure for mobility, voice becomes, as I said, kind of a paper right. It's not fulfilled. It's not. There's no fulfilling agency that comes with it unless you have some credible way of enforcing or making an employer change. Because workers end up changing when they see turnover rates go high or they hear from workers. Right? It's exit or voice. And in some combination of the two, it usually creates the mechanism for employers to make better employment conditions.
All right.
I saw Amanda had a question. I don't know. I think there was a hand up.
Well, we'll get to the hands in just a question, but thanks for articulating that, Raphael. And it sounds like the members will probably continue to wrestle exactly how that guarantee can be made with respect to the right to quit and so on. We'll come back to that when if we have a sec, but I want to move forward to our next question. We'll go to Abel next, and then Dennis, you'll be after that. So Abel, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
All right. My question goes to Professor Slynn. Looking at the discussion we had today with Professor Thomas, we realized that he made it clear that unionism has its own strength, but it is the number of union members have drastically declined over the years due to probably two factors. One is the culture in North America where people are becoming more individualistic. And probably the next one is outsiders' perception of unionism. Now, our question is this: if unionism is the best, what can these unions do to attract the young workers who have these objections and who obviously live and do most of their things collectively in their social media? How can they package unionism in such a way that they can use these avenues to attract these young workers?
I've long thought that unions should hire a good PR firm. That might be quite helpful. Canada has the interesting situation where we don't actually have the drastic reduction in unionization or collective bargaining coverage that we've seen in the United States. None, and that has probably made unions and Canada a little bit complacent and a little bit slow to address this ongoing change. So, a number of unions have in recent years experimented with trying to engage young workers in a variety of ways, including through non-union, non-certification, non-bargaining ways of engaging with workers. I think on the upside that what we see in recent years is a lot of engagement by some very young workers. And if we think of the gig and platform workers, not just in Canada, but many places in the world, my impression at least is that these are relatively younger workers, and they seem to be very, very engaged and very, very interested in acting in a collective manner with respect to their workplace interests and rights. So I'm not sure that's an area of particular expertise for me, but I know that unions have been thinking about it, and my non-expert recommendation would be a good PR campaign, because I think unions have a lot to offer, and people may not be aware of it. Raphael actually has done quite a bit of work and empirical work on unionism as an experience good, as economists would call it. And Raphael, please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing your work, but I think that in a nutshell, what it finds is that people who have engaged with unions and have had some experience of what unions do and how they operate and what they can offer are significantly more supportive of unions. So once they see what they can do, it becomes very compelling.
That's right, Sarah. That's exactly right. So experiential goods are things that you only determine quality after you decided to purchase or made a promise to purchase. Like a hair salon, you go in and sit in the seat and they cut your hair or whatever, but you don't know how good quality that is until you've actually experienced it. And unions have these properties, good or bad. You do learn about the full cost benefit experience once you've had some exposure to unions. And this, of course, can also come indirectly if your parents or your family members are union members, or you're in a community that has a very strong union culture. You learn this as well. And that's an important attribute of unionism, to be sure, to learn more about it. Of course, for some people, it might turn them off, but on average, it seems that a majority are more supportive.
I wanted to jump in here and just offer a chance for either Cynthia or Meredith. Did either of you want to comment on this idea of how to strengthen unions so that they might better attract and represent people who aren't currently covered by unions?
I did want to make a point related to this issue of experience being generally a spur to interest in unions, because I think there's evidence also that when workers experience other forums, other kind of opportunities for voice, that can kind of prime the pump, so to speak. So if we had something like the Works Council system that I think, Sarah, you must have talked about a bit, right? The idea that there would be, the idea of a Works Council, you don't have to have a majority support before having this representational structure. It's practically, a small showing of interest, and then there's a process for electing representatives. And when workers have a chance to participate in that, and they sense, they sort of internalize the idea that they are actually entitled to participate, that can provide, and I think this is perhaps one of the reasons employers resist this kind of reform, it can provide, it sort of prime the pump and provide a better environment in which workers could say, so, we can provide a stronger voice for you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to turn the next question to Dennis. Dennis, do you want to go ahead and ask a question on behalf of your group? And then next we'll go to a member from Avni's breakout group. So Dennis, please go ahead. Give you a sec to, there you go.
Hi, good morning. We had quite a few comments about the questions that were raised and the policy options. What I'm seeing is that there's a lot of questions, but very few answers. And I think that everybody has to realize that businesses exist in order to create a product and a profit. And so I think besides asking for things, we should be also encouraging the workers to offer suggestions on how things can be improved for mutual advantage. And I can refer you to the CAW back in the 80s or whatever, when they broke away from the US automotive union, where the Canadians actually allowed for a couple of different objectives that the companies wanted and went along with them, and it improved car production. It included wages. It included better wages. So I think this has to be. I'm concerned about what we're going to recommend to a government when we're having trouble deciding between ourselves what the answers are. So I think we have to look at the overall scope. We have a recession probably coming. How is that going to affect us? That means probably more layoffs. This is a very difficult time. And so I think we have to be very careful in what we're recommending to the government. It should be positive. It should be positive for both the workers and for the companies. So
Okay.
we talked about many things, but that's my comments anyway.
So if I might just clarify, or this for our guests, it sounds like we're looking at Dennis. You're asking about ways that we're the best ways maybe by which workers and employers can come together to kind of sort out some of these issues without necessarily having to go with everything to government involvement. Can I invite maybe Meredith? I don't know if you wanted to comment on this, but let me open it up to any of our guests to respond to Dennis's comment about workers and employers kind of being in a boat to solve this together.
Let me just throw in one quick point that goes back to the discussion earlier about sectoral bargaining. Countries that have sectoral bargaining tend to, that bargaining takes place outside the enterprise, and it's a limited set of issues, mostly including major economic issues like wages. And one of the virtues of that is that then the enterprise level of voice and participation can be less adversarial. It can be more about topics on which there's a potential for mutual gains and coming together and cooperating. So that kind of separation, which I think is something like what Quebec has. I'm not sure, but the most developed system, of course, is in Germany, which has sectoral bargaining over major economic issues, and then designedly more cooperative works councils at the enterprise level. But I think you're right. There needs to be that kind of opportunity at the same time that there is an opportunity for workers to press for things that are more adversarial.
Okay, and I see that Sarah, you wanted to jump in on this as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up a little bit on Cynthia's note about how there can be what's called in the Canadian context two-tiered bargaining. Now, sectoral bargaining can happen in a bunch of different ways, but one way that it can be done is, as Cynthia says, having a master agreement at a higher level, at the regional or provincial or national level, and then enterprise level or lower level negotiations for other specific workplace related, more fine-tuned issues. And in fact, a lot of the public sector in Canada, in provinces, operates that way. Quebec operates that way throughout the public sector. British Columbia, throughout the public sector, you have a master agreement, for example, that deals with all teachers, all 25,000 teachers in British Columbia, but every school district also has local level bargaining and a local agreement to deal with certain sets of matters that are of specific local interest and need to be tailored. So that two-tier approach to sectoral bargaining, where you have both sector-wide and local bargaining at the same time, can be very productive. And we have a long history of that in Canada in the public sector.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Before I move on, Raphael or Meredith, did you want to respond to any of that? And then I do see a hand up, and we'll get around to it.
Yes, Dennis, I think that, so my overall feeling is that voice happens in stages. And I think that most organizations are at the stage where they're at the, what I call the awareness level stage, where they are just starting to think about the fact that voice can be a important and beneficial activity in their organization. So a lot of organizations are there. Some organizations are at later stages where they're starting to build, or they've built the capability. Because I think that doing voice effectively in organizations is a skill set. And it's a skill set that a lot of organizations don't have yet, partly because they don't have the practices and policies in place to be effective at it. So one of the things that I think is really important is you guys are working on building the awareness, but the next stage is also, how do you build the practices and policies within organizations that are going to support the process of exercising voice in a way that's effective in organizations? So maybe thinking about it in terms of building awareness and building policies and practices that are actually going to be effective, and reviewing those policies and practices, and problem solving through that kind of process. It's a stage way of thinking about it. And I think part of the challenge we have is that a lot of organizations are still at the awareness level. So you have to build an awareness, but you also have to look at the organizations that are trying to implement the policies and practices that are going to be effective, and see what works.
Okay, thank you
And
for that.
Just very quickly, Richard.
Sure.
Just one last issue that was raised by Meredith and was prompted by Dennis's comment. It's also true that employee involvement schemes and practices are experience goods for employers. As was said, that they have to learn some of the best ways to work with their employees. The more information employers have about the way work is getting done, the problems that workers are facing, the better ultimately it is for that company. In the short run, it might produce headaches for managers, but that's the point of management, is to solve problems. So if you can have institutions in the workplace that make those problems come to light faster, quicker, that don't build up and become chronic problems, then I think that's a good thing. But employers, you're right, have to learn as well, have to experience and make the adaptations that are best for them. Thank you.
Agree 100%.
Okay, well, thanks, Raphael, and everyone, and Dennis, of course. I'm going to just first flag everyone, if you're following the chat, there's some great comments coming in from members about some of these points being raised. I'm going to move next to a question from our last group, the group that Avni was facilitating, and then we'll open it up to questions after that. And Stephen, I do see that you do have your hand raised, and we'll come back around to you. Just a quick note, our facilitator Avni had to leave to deal with an emergency. So I don't know who from her group was ready to speak, but can I invite a person from Avni's breakout group to go ahead and put your top question forward?
Jillian,
Jillian?
go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I don't know. No one was really chosen to speak.
And it's you.
Yeah, I guess so. So we spoke a lot about sort of the most marginal people in our society. Sorry, one more. We spoke about, sort of like the most marginal workers in our society, and kind of feeling like a lot of us in our group, right, worked in office environments, and that that our voices, yes, that the strength of our voice in those workplaces needed to be improved, but that the level of precarity that we face as workers in Ontario was much less. And so I think one of our questions was like, how can we like, or what are like, it's not directed at any specific panelist, but what are the ways, or what are their thoughts around uncoupling worker like immigration status from employment, because that seems to be a really big issue, especially for migrant workers, and also for like international students who come and are limited to like specific work periods. A lot of us have experience, not necessarily personally, but like with coworkers or with friends or with family that whose ability to work in Canada was tied to their immigration status, and that their rights and their voice was limited by their immigration status. So I guess what is the thoughts from the panel about uncoupling those two things, and how could we go about like proposing that as a policy option?
Mhm. Okay, let me turn it over to our guests. I think that's a great question that kind of follows up on the earlier point around exactly what this assembly can do in terms of making recommendations and addressing the concerns around vulnerable workers. So does anyone have a response to that kind of follows up on our earlier discussion?
Richard, I'll just say two things that have crystallized from the earlier question in my mind.
Mhm.
They can be very easily distilled, and then others can weigh in. One is quicker pathways to permanent residency for all immigrants in Canada, whether they're here because of they're studying, or they're here as a temporary foreign worker, or as an agricultural temporary foreign worker. And secondly, mobility rights. So if the employment relationship isn't turning out the way it was supposed to for both the employer and the employee, regardless of their status, whether they're not permanent residents or not, they should be allowed to find other employment. And if that other employment is available and there's a concrete offer, they should be allowed to move. That's the whole point of labor markets. we need those abilities to make labor markets, free labor markets, work to make work better. And that would also make voice mechanisms inside workplaces work better.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. And before I move on, just wanted to clarify your response there. Would that entail changing or amending existing legislation, or how would you see the mechanism moving that forward for those 2 points?
Well, yeah, one is beyond the ability for provincial governments. This is a federal, immigration is a federal, except in Quebec, there's a stronger set of rights that are given over to the provincial government there. Maybe that's something that we should also explore nationally. Provinces should have a little more ability to make pathways for immigration easier for potential migrants. But yeah, one would be federal. I think probably on both ends, this is federal, because even the requirements to be able to move jobs is embedded in those associated rights that workers come when they're either temporary foreign workers or foreign students and so on. So it would be a federal jurisdiction, but it could be prompted by provincial efforts, right?
Wow. Okay, thanks for that.
And other worker groups, yeah.
Let me open it up to if any of our other panelists want to respond. I'm sure everyone's getting a strong sense of a core concern of this assembly around improving and protecting rights of the most vulnerable workers among us. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? In the meanwhile, I'll invite anyone who wants to raise their hand to pose another question to our group. Go ahead and do so, and I'll get to you in just a second if we have time. Stephen, I do see your hand is up, and I'll get to you just next. Okay, well, let me go ahead and move on then to some other questions. Stephen and then Dandy. Stephen, please go ahead.
Yes, I don't know if you can see me, but I'm here. I noticed that we're quite concerned about everybody having their rights and a voice. I'm a bit of a scenario person. I just want to remind people that back in 2008, General Motors Canada was going to go out of business temporarily or permanently. And the Ontario government loaned them $50 million to stay in business, which they did. And it was loan free. And I think within 3 or 4 years, General Motors did pay back all the money, the $50 million. Now, it was brought up that we're in a potential recessionary period. That's debatable or not, but I do watch and see that the dollar's falling, and that means things are going to be a little bit more expensive. There's 5 segments of people in society. There's workers, unions, management, that's people that own the company, shareholders. There's government, and 5th is the general public, which purchases goods and services from these other four organizations. And I think the best way to, and then it was brought up that we want to see if we can bring people together so that we can all have a voice. And everybody wants to have a voice, and we all want to work and produce and be beneficial to society. So based on what I said about General Motors, that the government helped them out, I'm thinking the government can play a part in bringing unions, workers' unions, and management together by the government, in that we could have a union, whether it's debatable, and then management may be for or against it, but if we did have a union and management accepted it, and the government would guarantee that it won't cut into their profits, workplace safety would increase, concerns of people would come together, and they would guarantee that they're not going to lose any profits, barring unforeseen. For example, if a manufacturer makes black and white television sets and color television sets have never been made, and there's a 2-year agreement, it's like an experiment.
Stephen, sorry, I'm just going to jump in here and just ask you if you wouldn't mind just getting to your specific question, so I can have our guests respond.
Okay, the question is, can we bring workers, union, and management and government together so that we can have a better workplace and that everyone's guaranteed? The main concern is that I've observed is that management doesn't want to lose money. So I think the government could bail them out, barring that their competitors don't come up with better products and that unforeseen things. Like they come up with a color television set. That might be no good anymore. Thank you.
Okay, so let me invite any of our panelists who want to respond. It seems like a big picture idea around how all of these different sort of actors on the stage around worker voice might be able to come together, whether there's an avenue for all of that to happen. Any comment on that? And then I'll move to our next question. That'll be you, Dandy. So maybe first invite our guests to respond.
Well, I don't want to be a broken record, but I do want to emphasize putting these comments together with the comments in the chat. I think emphasize how there are two very different things going on worker voice. One is fighting with management over who gets what share of the revenues, and the other is trying to make the organization, work productively, something that workers have a lot of input for. And I think that one of the problems with collective bargaining as the sole channel for collective worker participation is that it tries to put those things together. And every 3 years, there has to be a mobilization for fighting over profits every 3 years or so. And the real virtue of these dual channel systems is having somewhat different structures with different designs, one for fighting over who gets how much, and one for trying to increase the output and make the organization work better for everyone.
Okay, thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes left for our interaction here. So I'm going to go ahead and move ahead to Dandy next, and then Amanda. I'm not sure if I saw your physical hand go up earlier. So if you do have a question, I will follow, and then Tracy will get to you. So Dandy, please go ahead.
Yeah. So my questions are around I think the slightly newer models around, more specifically around the broader based bargaining, and also, ideas such as minority unionization, sectoral bargaining. So one of the things I think we observed is that the environment, right, like from all the speakers speaking as well, is changing. That our past successful examples were around, kind of the factories, auto workers, but now there is a shift to, more gig economy, precarious work. So there are a lot of debate and things that I heard is really exciting with these new kind of sectorial bargaining type of options. But I'm personally curious, are there working examples within the Canadian context that has been working, or do we feel like this is an area, to Professor Goldman's point, right? It's always about practice. Is this like a brand new area that we are venturing into? So I want to hear about those specific examples, and then kind of like your thoughts on this like a new changing environment and the relevancy of the 15 options that we're putting forward within this changing context.
Do you want me to try and address parts of that?
Sure, please go ahead, Sarah.
Okay. So sectoral bargaining is not new in North America, and it's in particular not new in Canada, and it's not new in Ontario. In Canada right now, we have several examples of sectoral bargaining in particular jurisdictions and in particular public or private sectors and particular industries or occupations. So right now in Canada, we have, for example, the public sector in Quebec has two-tier bargaining, actually three-tier bargaining. All of the public sector in British Columbia has two-tier bargaining. Some parts of public sector in Ontario have two-tier bargaining. For example, two-tier bargaining has operated first informally and then statutorily in K-12 education in Ontario for a number of years. That was adapted from the British Columbia model. In the private sector, we have sectoral bargaining in the auto sector that's gone on for decades. That's not statutory, it's informal. We have statutory sectoral bargaining in the construction industry in every jurisdiction in Canada. We have in the private sector in Quebec and federally for artists who are independent contractors and therefore not able to organize under other collective bargaining legislation. We have separate Status of the Artist Act legislation that's bargaining at a sectoral level with a single bargaining agent for the entire province or for regions. So, and Ontario has had, there's of course the decree system in Quebec, where a particular occupation for a geographic area that could range from something like the island of Montreal to the entirety of the province bargains a collective agreement. Ontario had legislation like the Decrees Act until 2001. So this is not brand new. It's not familiar to a lot of people, but it is not a new thing in Canada. And these have operated for a variety of different kinds of occupations. People describe artists as the original gig workers, musicians and gigs. That's where the word gig comes from. So I'm particularly of the view that the Status of the Artist Act type of sectoral bargaining, which if we think back to our diagram from the other day, would be the upper right quadrant. So truly sectoral bargaining and actual bargaining rather than recommendations. I think that would work very well for new gig workers like Uber drivers or Lyft drivers or Foodora workers, the new gig workers. It's operated quite well for artists, the traditional gig worker in the federal sector and in Quebec for quite a few years, for quite a few decades. And that legislation is sort of internationally regarded as as a prime example of how to deal with gig workers in the artistic context. I hope that helps a bit.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks,
certainly.
Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.
We have time, I think, for at least one more question. And I just want to invite anyone else, if we don't get a chance to ask your question right now, please do put your question into the chat or send it to one of us directly. We'll make sure that someone from our project team gets back to you on that question, especially as it relates to possibly moving forward with the work of the rest of this assembly. So I'm going to give Amanda a chance, because Amanda, I'm not sure if I saw your hand up earlier, your real hand, that is, if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, I can move on. But since I may have seen you, please go ahead.
Okay. I'm wondering, this is sort of what Sarah said, but I totally agree with that. Can we not go back to a system of professional guilds that create a framework for what the, I guess we're going to have to go with minimum work standards, and they would have to break it off into several sections, but then you could go to the table with the employers and have a centralized agreement to cover those professional associations. And my other question, really important question, is how do we legislate kindness, gentleness within the law that encompasses the least of us in society? And that seems what we always seem to forget. And we may have to do that federally, especially with our immigration policies on work, because we are facing drastic gaps in our employment. For one incident, doctors and nurses and those in the medical professions. Why can't we fast track a doctor from Ethiopia to come into our society and into our professional associations and make that more permanent, fast track it, and not limit it to, like, I don't know, but we would have to decide what our society needs as a whole. And also we need to get rid of the vagaries of, let's say, party policy. Like every time the government changes, that fundamental legislation doesn't change. Like it becomes part of our charter.
Okay, well, let me invite, I think that's a great question, a couple of great questions about it. Let me invite our guests to kind of use that question as maybe as way of getting your parting advice to us as an assembly, whether it's around ensuring kindness, but also Amanda's last question about making sure that these policies, how can we make them stick, make them long lasting? Thank you so much. So for any of our guests, if you want to kind of jump in and just give us your lasting advice, thank you very much.
I'll try to start with the point about legislating kindness, which I think is probably not possible. And the most we've tried to do on that front, though, is to at least prohibit the most serious kinds of unkindness, harassment, which we could do more broadly. And at least in the US, it's limited, that prohibition on harassment is limited to discriminatory harassment. We could generalize the concept to say harassment. Now, if employers are afraid of liability for harassment, they might find it in their interest to try to promote an environment of greater kindness. But my bigger point, I think, is that if workers are given or have, or sometimes even if they fight for, a forum in which they realize that they share certain interests and they have to kind of work together to figure out what those are. It might be a union, it might be a works council, almost any of these. If you put workers together and give them opportunities to exchange experiences and opinions, we can at least hope that that promotes some mutual respect as well as empowerment of workers. The more we separate workers by occupation, some of which we absolutely have to do, the less of that we're going to get, the less of the more inclusive kind of mutual respect we're going to get. So some kind of, you know, layered or multiple fora in which people have that experience of exchanging views, I think that would be about the best we could do by way of legislation.
Thanks very much, Cynthia. In our last minute, any final thoughts from our guests? We do so appreciate you giving your time to us.
I'll just jump in and say that what I've been reminded of in this discussion is that from a job satisfaction perspective, the research is very clear that job satisfaction is a wide set of criteria, some of which are financial in terms of rewards and whatnot for the work that we do, but non-financial rewards matter a lot to people. And I think that employers forget that. And it really does matter. The research is very clear that people can be satisfied with their compensation and deeply unsatisfied with other components of their work. Same because they're not heard, because they don't feel respected, because they aren't treated with kindness at work, those sorts of things. So the financial and the non-financial package of work, all of that matters. And I think that employers need to be reminded that even though we tend to separate those things as being two separate pieces, at the end of the day, in the psychological level, each individual assesses their job holistically, and they assess their satisfaction with all these different components overall. So we can divide those, but I think that if you really want to maintain satisfaction, you got to think of both ways. And I think that employers need to hear the message more and more that the non-financial piece really does matter as well. So that's my final thought on that.
Thank you so much, Meredith. And thank you to all of our wonderful guests for coming back to us, to Meredith, to Cynthia, to Sarah, to Raphael. Your interest and investment in this assembly is exemplary. We really do appreciate you giving your time to us. And you will, no doubt hear from the assembly again when we circle around and put out the assembly's final report, and we'll love to have your feedback on that. But thank you once again. We really do appreciate it. I do know that there's a few more questions out there. I regret we couldn't get time to them all. Please do, to all of our members, put your questions in the chat or send them to us directly. We'll make sure that we get them answered as best as we can.